From millionaire to zero on his wedding day, what happened next will shock you. Jake Miller was living the dream, or so it seemed. At 35, he had it all. A booming career, a fortune that could make kings envious, and Ashley Davis, his fiancée, a woman who looked like she'd walked straight off a magazine cover. Ashley wasn't just beautiful, she was the perfect partner for Jake's flawless life. They were the power couple everyone in Chicago society whispered about, and today was the day it all became official, the wedding. The city had been buzzing for weeks about this event, a spectacle designed to make every other wedding look like a backyard barbecue. Exotic flowers flown in from halfway around the world, a venue dripping in gold and crystal, and a guest list that read like a who's who of Chicago's elite. For Jake, it was just another day in the spotlight, another chance to bask in the glow of his own success. He was used to being the center of attention, comfortable in the role of the city's golden boy. But something felt off. As Jake adjusted his tie, staring at his reflection, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. Persistent calls from his lawyers had been buzzing his phone for days. Business, he'd told himself, could wait. Nothing could be more important than his wedding day. But now, looking at himself in the mirror, something felt wrong. Maybe it was the strained silence in the air, or the relentless vibrating of his phone in his pocket. A constant, nagging interruption to his thoughts. Ignoring the unease, Jake took a deep breath. "Today is my day," he muttered to his reflection. "Nothing will ruin this." Or so he desperately hoped. Outside his door, Mike, his best man, was practically bouncing with excitement, ready to usher him down the aisle and into marital bliss. The world outside was a picture of perfection. Eager guests, flashing cameras, photographers poised to capture every moment of the social event of the year. Just as Jake reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed again, more insistent than ever. He froze. Something deep inside him screamed that this wasn't just another trivial business call. Reluctantly, he pulled out his phone. Robert, his lead lawyer, was calling. Jake hesitated. He could ignore it, as he'd been doing, but something compelled him to answer. "Jake, we need to talk." Robert's voice was strained, tight with something ominous. Something was terribly wrong. "Robert, today is not the day. I'm about to get married. Can't this wait?" "No, Jake, it can't wait." The pause on the other end of the line stretched, heavy and suffocating. "The deal with Titan Corp, it's fallen apart." For a moment, Jake didn't understand. "Fallen apart? What are you talking about?" "The investment, Jake, the funds, we lost everything." Silence. Jake was silent, the phone suddenly slick with sweat in his hand, threatening to slip from his grasp. Lost everything? No, that's impossible. He'd built his empire on solid ground. With the best advisors, the shrewdest partners, nothing could collapse like this. "What do you mean, lost everything?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, trying to maintain a semblance of calm while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Titan Corp went bankrupt, Jake. And all your money, it went with them. There's nothing we can do." Each word from Robert was like a physical blow, each syllable chipping away at the life Jake knew. His heart plummeted. Everything he'd built, his entire kingdom, gone. He blinked, still staring at his reflection in the mirror, trying to absorb the impossible information. This morning, he'd been one of the wealthiest men in the city. Now, bankrupt. So, what do I do? The question escaped his lips. A raw, involuntary sound, a thought he'd never entertained before. Jake Miller, the man who always had the answers, was suddenly, terrifyingly lost. "We need to meet right away, to strategize, to figure out a plan. I'm on my way to the wedding venue now." Robert hung up before Jake could even respond. Jake slowly turned back to the mirror. He looked at himself, but the reflection staring back was no longer that of a confident titan. It was the reflection of a ghost. He saw himself standing there, decked out in a suit that cost more than some people's houses, ready for a wedding that now felt like a cruel joke. His heart raced, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, chilling silence in his ears. He had to make a decision. The door burst open, and Mike strode in, grinning from ear to ear. "Hey, champ, ready to conquer the world? Again?" Jake forced a smile. A hollow, brittle thing. Inside, his world was crumbling to dust. He looked at Mike, his best friend, unsure, paralyzed. Should he tell him? Should he tell anyone? Or should he just go through with it, pretend everything was fine, a grotesque charade? What would Ashley say? How would she react if she knew the man she was about to marry was now penniless? Jake glanced towards the hallway, towards the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the eager guests already taking their seats, blissfully unaware of the earthquake that had just ripped through his life. He'd had everything anyone could ever dream of, but in a single phone call, it had all vanished. The question wasn't just what he would do now, but who he even was now. Jake Miller felt like he'd been plunged into a nightmare, a grotesque parody of his perfect life. The wedding, the day he'd envisioned as the ultimate symbol of his triumph, was about to become an unimaginable disaster. Everything he'd worked for, his reputation, his fortune, his power, was unraveling before his eyes, and he was utterly helpless to stop it. Outside, the sounds of laughter, chatter, and champagne flutes clinking only amplified the tension tearing him apart. For them, it was just another lavish display, another glimpse into the world of the ultra-rich. For Jake, it was the beginning of a catastrophic fall. His heart hammered, Robert's words echoing in his head. "You've lost everything." How could it be true? How could he, Jake Miller, one of Chicago's most successful men, lose absolutely everything in a single moment? It was surreal, a twisted joke, but the ice dread gripping his chest screamed that it was terrifyingly real. "Jake, are you ready?" Mike's carefree voice, his oblivious enthusiasm, snapped Jake back to reality. He slowly turned to his friend, but the words caught in his throat. How could he tell him? How could he explain that at the very peak of his success, his life had imploded so brutally? He knew he had to be honest, with Mike, with Ashley, with everyone. But the fear, the crushing weight of public humiliation, the thought of everyone seeing him as a fraud, a broken man with nothing, paralyzed him. He turned towards the door that separated him from Ashley, feeling the unbearable weight of the walk he was about to take. On the other side, the woman he believed he would spend his life with was waiting, probably making the final adjustments to her flawless wedding dress, completely oblivious to the chaos about to erupt. Just as Jake was about to open the door, it swung open suddenly. Jessica, one of Ashley's bridesmaids and a close friend, rushed in, her eyes wide with panic. "Jake, we need to talk." The urgency in her voice sent another jolt of ice fear through him. His heart pounded even harder. "What is it?" he managed, his throat dry, feeling like the floor was about to give way beneath him. "Ashley, she's heard rumors. Whispers that something's wrong, that your business isn't doing well. She wants to know the truth, Jake. Now." Jessica stared at him, her expression a mixture of worry and expectation, waiting for him to deny it, to reassure her. Jake's world spun faster. Time was running out. Ashley knew. Somehow, the news of his bankruptcy had already leaked, even before he could tell her himself. He had a choice. Lie, try to salvage the ceremony, to postpone the inevitable crash, or admit everything, face the music, and brace for the fallout. Jake knew, deep down, that there was no more room for lies, no more space to hide. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, faltering at the edges. "She's in the preparation room waiting for you," Jessica said, her eyes full of concern, giving him a worried look. "Jake, you need to talk to her now, before things get worse." Jake walked past Jessica, feeling the walls closing in, the air thickening. Each step towards Ashley felt heavier than the last, dragging him down, down, into the abyss. He stopped in front of the door, took a ragged breath, and entered. Ashley was standing with her back to him, facing a large mirror. The reflection showed a vision of an impeccable bride, meticulously adjusting her veil. She looked so perfect, so serene, as if nothing could possibly shatter the illusion of this perfect moment. But Jake knew he was about to shatter it all, irrevocably. Ashley turned as she heard the door close. Her eyes, once sparkling with anticipation, were now clouded, dark with a premonition, as if she already knew what he was about to say. She stood silent for a long moment, watching Jake, her expression a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Jake, what's going on?" Her voice was low, controlled, but Jake could feel the tension vibrating beneath the surface, the barely suppressed panic. Jake struggled to find the words, to even begin to explain the cataclysm that had just ripped through his life. How could he tell the woman he was about to marry that everything was gone? No fortune, no security, no future as they'd imagined it. "Ashley, he started, but the words seemed to stick in his throat, choking him. He took a deep breath, forced the truth out. "I've lost everything. The business, it collapsed. I'm bankrupt." The word bankrupt hung in the air between them, a death sentence, the sound of an empire crumbling. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the frantic pounding of Jake's heart. Ashley stood frozen, as if his words were a physical blow, as if she'd been struck dumb. She blinked a few times, trying to process the impossible news, the reality that was crashing down around her. What? Was all she could manage at first, her voice barely a whisper. What do you mean bankrupt? How could that happen? Her voice rose, the carefully constructed control starting to fracture, crumble. Jake stepped forward, reaching for her, desperate to explain, to somehow make sense of the senseless. It was a financial storm, Ashley, something we couldn't foresee. Titan Corp, it went under, and with it, all our money. I really don't know what to do. Ashley recoiled, stepping back, her face twisting with disbelief, with a dawning, terrifying anger. You lost everything? The disbelief in her voice was razor sharp, laced with accusation. How could you let this happen, Jake? How could you bring me here knowing you're bankrupt? You lied to me, to all of us. Jake tried to close the distance between them, but Ashley backed away, her eyes now blazing with fury, with betrayal. And what do you expect me to do now? She shouted, her voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. Stand by you while you start over from nothing? Live a life without luxury, without anything? That's not what you promised me, Jake. That's not what I signed up for. Jake felt a crushing weight in his chest, her words like shards of glass piercing his soul. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was about more than money, more than just a financial disaster. Her reaction, her raw, visceral fury, spoke volumes about the fragile, transactional nature of their relationship. What had she really wanted? The man he was, or the lifestyle he provided? Before he could even formulate a response, Ashley turned sharply, snatching the bouquet from her hands and throwing it to the floor with a violent, resounding thud. She looked at Jake, her eyes filled with contempt, with utter disdain. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed out of the room, leaving Jake standing alone, stunned, utterly devastated. Her voice, sharp and cold, echoed back from the hallway loud enough for everyone outside to hear, to witness his public humiliation. I can't do this. I can't marry someone who has nothing. And with that, Ashley was gone, leaving Jake alone in the wreckage of his perfect life. The murmurs of the guests outside swelled, a rising tide of whispers, as they began to grasp the unfolding drama, the catastrophic implosion of the wedding of the year. Jake, in shock, could barely process the surprised, then pitying, then judgmental looks as Ashley swept past them, tearing off her veil, tossing it to the ground like garbage before disappearing through the nearest exit. Standing there in the opulent preparation room, Jake felt like he'd lost more than just his fortune. He'd lost everything, his reputation, his pride, and now the woman he'd thought would be his partner for life. Jake stood in the opulent room, the silence deafening after Ashley's dramatic exit. The buzzing of the guests outside grew louder, a swarm of whispers and shocked gasps. What was supposed to be the celebration of a fairy tale wedding had morphed into a public spectacle of abandonment and ruin. He felt the crushing weight of failure, heavier than any physical burden he'd ever carried. It wasn't just the money, the lost fortune that had slipped through his fingers. It was the dismantling of his entire identity, the erosion of the respect he'd always commanded, and now, the brutal rejection by the woman he'd believed loved him. Everything he had built, every carefully constructed facade was collapsing around him, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing he could eat. Come stop it, man. Jake took a deep, shuddering breath and slowly walked out of the preparation room, the scene of Ashley's devastating confrontation. He could feel the eyes on him as he walked down the hallway, a gauntlet of judgment. The whispers intensified, a chorus of speculation and pity. Faces he'd once known as friends, business partners, confidants, now looked at him with a mix of surprise and open disapproval. It was as if he'd become invisible, or worse, a pariah. On the other side of the room, Mike, still blissfully unaware of the full extent of the disaster, found him. His usual grin had vanished, replaced by a bewildered frown as he began to sense the chaotic energy swirling around them. He approached Jake, a worried question etched on his face, desperate to understand the unfolding catastrophe. "Jake, what was that? What's happening?" Mike asked, his voice laced with confusion and alarm. Jake didn't know how to respond, how to articulate the earthquake that had just shattered his world. He was surrounded by people, by judging eyes, and with each passing second, more and more guests were turning towards him, waiting for an explanation, for some kind of statement, but how could he explain that in a single brutal phone call his entire life had crumbled to pieces? "Not here, Mike," Jake murmured, his voice tense, exhausted, barely above a whisper. He gestured for Mike to follow him, to escape the suffocating scrutiny, to find a moment of fragile privacy amidst the public unraveling. They slipped through side doors of the hall, leaving behind the restless whispers, the sea of curious eyes. The cool Chicago air outside offered a brief, illusory sense of relief, but the cold reality of his situation quickly crashed down around him. He knew he had to tell Mike, someone he trusted, someone who might, just might, understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "What was that, Jake? What was Ashley talking about?" Mike repeated, his voice now urgent, laced with genuine concern. Jake took another deep breath, the air catching in his lungs, still struggling to gather the shattered fragments of his thoughts. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, for a few seconds that felt like an eternity, until he finally spoke, the words raw and painful. "I lost everything, Mike. All of it. My money, the business, the investments, everything." The words were like shards of glass in his mouth, each syllable making the reality more agonizingly real. Mike stared at him speechless, his face registering disbelief, then dawning comprehension. He opened his mouth to speak, but the enormity of the news seemed to have stolen his words. How did this happen?" Mike finally stammered, still stunned, his eyes wide with shock. "Titan Corp, it went bankrupt, and I lost everything I had in it." Jake looked down at the ground, the shame burning like acid in his throat. And Ashley left. She's gone. She doesn't want to be with me without the money." Mike shook his head slowly, still trying to process the impossible news. He'd known Jake for years, seen him navigate countless challenges, always coming out on top. He'd never imagined him reaching this point, this precipice of utter ruin. Jake had always been so confident, so invincible, a man who seemed to have everything under control, everything within his grasp. Seeing his friend now, broken, falling apart, felt surreal, like a scene from a nightmare. "What are you going to do?" Mike asked, his voice soft, filled with genuine concern. Jake didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he was utterly, terrifyingly lost. He'd always had a plan, a solution for every problem, a strategy to navigate any crisis and emerge victorious. But this time, there was no playbook, no escape route. This time, he was completely adrift, swallowed by the storm. I don't know," Jake admitted, his voice faltering, cracking under the weight of despair. "I don't know where to start. Everything I was, everything I had, it's just gone." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of utter helplessness, trying to push away the crushing despair threatening to engulf him. Mike watched his friend in silence for a long moment, his expression shifting from shock to resolve. He placed a firm hand on Jake's shoulder, a gesture of unwavering support. "We'll start over," Mike said, his voice simple but filled with a quiet determination that cut through Jake's despair. "It won't be easy, not by a long shot, but you're not alone in this, Jake. We'll figure something out. You'll get back on your feet. It might take time, it might look different, but you'll come through this." Jake looked at Mike, a tiny spark of hope flickering in the darkness. The idea of starting over, of rebuilding from absolute zero, seemed impossible, a Herculean task beyond his shattered strength. But maybe, just maybe, with Mike's unwavering support, he could find a way, a path forward. Maybe he could take the first, agonizing steps towards picking up the pieces, towards finding his way back to the light. I don't know where to begin," Jake murmured, the weight of uncertainty still heavy in his voice, the vastness of the task overwhelming him. Mike gave a small, reassuring smile, a flicker of his old optimism returning. "First, let's get the hell out of here. You don't need to face all those staring faces today. Let's go somewhere quiet, somewhere we can actually think and figure out what to do next." Jake nodded, a silent agreement. He knew Mike was right. Staying there, surrounded by the wreckage of his ruined wedding, surrounded by people who would only see him as the bankrupt millionaire, would only deepen his despair, crush his spirit further. He needed space, time to breathe, to begin to accept his new, brutal reality, and to even begin to contemplate a next step, a path forward. As they walked away from the wedding venue together, leaving behind the hushed whispers, the judging eyes, Jake glanced back at the grand hall, the place that should have been the stage for the happiest day of his life. Now, all that remained was emptiness, a chilling silence. The sounds of laughter and celebration had faded, replaced by the gathering shadows of the Chicago night. Each step he took alongside Mike was a stark reminder that from this moment on, everything would be different. He had lost everything, the life he knew, the man he thought he was. But maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something new to grow from the ashes, a chance to start again, to become someone different. Jake wasn't entirely sure how or even if he could do it, but for the first time since the phone call that had shattered his world, he felt a glimmer of resolve, a flicker of hope in the darkness. Jake wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up in this quiet, forgotten corner of the world. The last week had been a blur, a chaotic rush of escape and disorientation. He'd fled Chicago shortly after the wedding implosion, feeling more lost, more adrift than ever before. The city that had once celebrated him, that had been his kingdom, now felt oppressive, suffocating, filled with memories he desperately wanted to erase. So, when Mike suggested he needed to get away, to disappear for a while, Jake hadn't hesitated. He'd packed a bag, grabbed his wallet, and left, without a plan, without a destination, just a desperate need to escape. Now, he found himself in a small town nestled deep in the Illinois countryside, far removed from the glittering skyscrapers and frenetic energy of Chicago, far from the world of luxury and power that had once defined his existence. The town was simple, almost rustic, surrounded by endless fields of corn and aging farmhouses. The slow, deliberate pace of life here was a stark contrast to the relentless hustle and bustle of the city. But Jake realized, with a strange sense of relief, that he desperately needed this quiet, this isolation. He needed space to breathe, to untangle the wreckage of his life, to process the catastrophic events that had unfolded, and to even begin to consider how to rebuild, or if rebuilding was even possible. Jake settled into a small rented house on the outskirts of town. No grand mansions, no sprawling estates, no luxury cars. Just a modest house, a bare minimum of furniture, a bed, a table, a chair. For someone who had been accustomed to the finest things money could buy, the stark simplicity of his new life was a jarring shock, a brutal awakening. But in a strange way, it was also a relief. Here, in this forgotten town, no one knew who he was. No one expected anything from him. He was just another face in the small-town crowd, another man trying to make his way, to find his footing. He was free to be anonymous, to shed the weight of his former identity, to simply exist. To keep himself occupied, to ward off the crushing weight of his own thoughts, Jake took a temporary job at a local diner. The owner, a gruff but decent middle-aged man named Joe, had no idea who Jake Miller was, and Jake was determined to keep it that way. He didn't want anyone in this town to know about his past life of wealth and power, about his spectacular fall from grace. He just wanted to blend in, to disappear into the anonymity of small-town life. The work at the diner was simple, mundane, clearing tables, serving coffee, taking orders, helping out in the kitchen when things got busy. For someone who had once managed multi-million-dollar businesses, who had commanded armies of staff, the work felt almost laughably beneath him. But at the same time, strangely, it gave him a sense of purpose, a sense of routine that he hadn't expected. It kept him busy, kept his mind occupied, at least for a few hours each day, and more importantly, it kept him from being completely consumed by the relentless, agonizing cycle of his own thoughts. However, the ghost of his former life was always there, lurking in the shadows, a constant, nagging presence in the back of his mind. The stark contrast between who he once was and who he had become was a bitter pill to swallow, a daily reminder of his colossal failure. One of the biggest challenges, though, was confronting his own arrogance. Jake had always seen himself as superior, destined for success, a cut above everyone else. Now, he was just an employee at a small-town diner, serving lukewarm coffee to people who had never heard of Jake Miller, who wouldn't care if they did, and that, more than the loss of his fortune, more than the public humiliation, bothered him, gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But the work at the diner also brought something unexpected, something subtly transformative, a new perspective. And this slow, gradual shift began when he met Sarah, a waitress who worked alongside him. Sarah was unlike anyone Jake had ever known in his privileged, insulated world. She was practical, down to earth, fiercely independent, and above all, genuinely kind. She didn't care about status, about money, about the superficial markers of success that had once defined Jake's entire universe. To Sarah, what mattered were the simple things: honesty, hard work, genuine connection, and most importantly, living authentically, being true to yourself. At first, Jake didn't know what to make of her. He was used to people fawning over him, flattering him, treating him with a deference bordering on reverence. Sarah, on the other hand, treated him like any other coworker, no better, no worse. She wasn't impressed by his past, by his former wealth or power, and that initially unsettled him, even irritated him. But at the same time, there was something undeniably refreshing about her attitude, her complete lack of pretense. For the first time in a long time, he found himself surrounded by someone who expected nothing from him but honesty, genuine effort, and basic human decency. One night, after a particularly long and grueling day at the diner, Jake and Sarah were cleaning up, the only two left in the quiet, dimly lit space. The silence between them was comfortable, companionable, but at the same time, Jake felt a sudden, almost overwhelming urge to break through the surface, to confide in her, to share the weight he'd been carrying alone for so long. "Have you ever wondered what you'd do if everything went wrong?" Jake asked suddenly, the question escaping his lips almost involuntarily, without conscious thought. Sarah stopped wiping down the counter, turned and looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes, intrigued by the unexpected question. "What do you mean by that?" she replied, her voice soft, curious. "If you lost everything," Jake insisted, pressing on, his voice quieter now, more introspective. "If your life just turned upside down overnight, what would you do?" Sarah paused, considering his question, her brow furrowed in thought. After a moment, she answered, her voice matter-of-fact, almost casual. I think I've lost everything once already," she said simply, her gaze steady, unwavering. "And, well, here I am." She shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible gesture. Sometimes losing everything is what makes us realize what really matters. Jake fell silent, absorbing her words, the quiet weight of her confession. It was strange, almost surreal to hear someone speak so openly, so matter-of-factly about something he'd been struggling to process, to articulate for weeks. But at the same time, Sarah's words resonated with him, carrying a quiet truth, a simple wisdom he couldn't ignore. I had everything, you know?" Jake confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, avoiding her gaze, staring down at the worn linoleum floor. "And I lost it all. I don't know how to start over." Sarah watched him for a long moment, her expression gentle, devoid of judgment, just quiet listening. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, she said, Maybe you're thinking too much about what you lost, Jake, and not enough about what you can gain." The simplicity of that response struck Jake with unexpected force, a quiet revelation. He had been so consumed, so utterly fixated on what had been taken from him, the fortune, the status, the security, the life he'd known, that he hadn't even considered the possibility of gain, of something new emerging from the wreckage. Sarah, with her practical, straightforward view of life, seemed to see something he couldn't, something he'd been blind to, the inherent value in simple things, in genuine connections, in the quiet strength of resilience, things that money couldn't buy, things he'd never truly appreciated until he'd lost everything else. That night, as he walked back to the small, rented house that had become his temporary home, Jake began to reflect on Sarah's words, on her quiet wisdom. Maybe there was something in this simple life, this stripped-down existence that he hadn't yet realized, hadn't yet grasped. Maybe, in some strange, unexpected way, this was the fresh start he so desperately needed, the blank slate he hadn't even known he craved. But to truly find it, to truly embrace this new beginning, he would have to let go of the man he used to be, the identity he'd clung to so fiercely, and begin accepting the man he was becoming, the man he was slowly, tentatively discovering in the quiet spaces of his new, unexpected life. The days Jake spent working at the diner began to shift, imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. Life, which had initially seemed like nothing more than a relentless series of defeats and disappointments, began to take on a new shape, a new texture. He still carried the weight of his catastrophic fall, the shame of his public humiliation, but gradually, almost unconsciously, he was learning to live with less expectation, less luxury, and surprisingly, fewer worries. And most importantly, he was learning to live with more simplicity, more authenticity, more genuine connection, and of course there was Sarah. There was something about Sarah, about her quiet strength, her unwavering kindness, that affected Jake in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. Sarah seemed to possess a natural lightness, an innate ability to navigate the complexities of life with grace and resilience, to deal with problems directly, without carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was unlike anything he had ever encountered in his previous life, a world of manufactured smiles and calculated interactions. Sarah wasn't interested in money, status, or appearances. To her, life was about what you did with what you had, not about what you owned, not about the superficial markers of success that had once defined Jake's entire existence. Jake didn't know exactly when his feelings for Sarah began to deepen, to shift from simple admiration to something more profound, more complex. Perhaps it was on an ordinary afternoon, while they were cleaning the diner together, sharing quiet jokes and comfortable silences. Or maybe it was when he noticed her smile while serving customers. Always genuine, always real, radiating a warmth that seemed to fill the small diner with a sense of unexpected grace. The truth was, Sarah was gradually, imperceptibly beginning to occupy a space in his thoughts, in his heart, in a way he couldn't control, in a way he didn't want to control. On a Friday night, after another long and demanding day of work, Joe, the diner owner, decided to close up early, a rare treat for the small staff. Sarah and Jake offered to stay behind and help clean up to get everything ready for the next day. The night was cool, a gentle breeze drifting through the open windows, and the silence in the small diner felt more comfortable, more intimate than ever. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, wiping counters, stacking chairs, until Sarah unexpectedly broke the quiet, her voice soft but direct. "So, Jake, what are you going to do now?" she asked, without taking her eyes off the counter she was wiping, her movements deliberate, efficient. The question seemed innocent enough, a casual inquiry, but Jake knew there was something more beneath the surface, a deeper curiosity, a gentle probing. She was trying to understand what was going on inside his head, just as he had been struggling to make sense of his own feelings, his own uncertain future. He paused for a moment, setting the cloth aside, turning to face her, his gaze meeting hers. "I'm not really sure," he admitted, his voice honest, vulnerable. I guess I'm still trying to figure out who I am without all of that." He gestured vaguely, encompassing his lost fortune, his former identity, everything he had left behind. "And you?" he asked, turning the question back to her, seeking to understand her, to bridge the gap between them. "What would you do?" Sarah stopped what she was doing, turned fully to face him, and looked him directly in the eyes, this time with a more serious expression, a deeper intensity. After a brief pause, she said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper, and there was a subtle weight to her words, a hint of unspoken history. "I've done that once before, Jake." Jake remained silent, surprised, almost stunned by her unexpected confession. He had never imagined that Sarah, with her quiet strength, her seemingly effortless grace, could have gone through something similar, could have experienced the same kind of devastating loss, the same kind of radical transformation. She always seemed so at peace with her simple life, so grounded, so sure of herself. Sure, but for the first time, he began to wonder about her past, about the experiences that had shaped her, about the challenges she had faced before finding her way to this quiet corner of the world. "What happened?" he asked, his voice soft, respectful, trying not to sound intrusive, but genuinely curious, wanting to understand the story behind her calm demeanor, the strength beneath her gentle exterior. Sarah smiled slightly, but it was a sad smile, tinged with a hint of melancholy. She continued cleaning the counter, her movements slow, deliberate, as if the words were difficult to say, as if the memories were still raw, still close to the surface. "I grew up in a wealthy family," she began, her voice taking on a slightly nostalgic tone, but it wasn't exactly a happy nostalgia. "My parents, they had big businesses, a lot of money, a life of luxury." She paused, her gaze drifting, lost in the echoes of the past. "A life of luxury," she repeated, the words almost tasting bitter on her tongue. "But it wasn't exactly a happy childhood." She sighed, a soft, almost inaudible sound. Everything was about status, about keeping up appearances, about being perfect. In the end, I felt like I didn't really know who I was. I only knew what people expected me to be. Jake watched her closely, listening intently, feeling an unexpected connection to her story, a strange resonance with her unspoken pain. Sarah's experience, in a way, mirrored his own, but with one crucial difference. She had chosen to leave that world behind, to walk away from the gilded cage while he had been brutally ejected, stripped bare and left to face the consequences of his own ambition. And then? He asked, pressing gently, wanting to understand what had driven her to make such a radical change, to abandon the life she'd known. Sarah sighed again, a slightly heavier sound this time, the weight of memory pressing down on her. When I was 23, she said, her voice regaining a hint of firmness, of resolve, I decided I didn't want that life anymore. I left everything behind. She paused, a small, almost defiant lift to her chin. My parents, they told me I was being ungrateful, that I'd never survive without their money, without their connections. But I knew that if I stayed in that life, in that world, I'd become someone I didn't want to be. Jake felt an unexpected surge of admiration for her courage, her conviction, her willingness to sacrifice everything material for the sake of her own authenticity, her own sense of self. He had always believed, implicitly, that money was the key to happiness, the foundation of a good life. But now, listening to Sarah, hearing her story, he started to realize, with a dawning sense of clarity, that maybe, just maybe, what he had always valued, what he had chased so relentlessly, wasn't as important, wasn't as real as he had always thought. Was it easy? Jake asked, a hint of irony, a touch of self-deprecation, creeping into his voice. Sarah laughed softly, a genuine, unburdened sound that filled the quiet diner. No, she said, shaking her head, her smile fading, replaced by a more thoughtful, more serious expression. No, not easy at all. She paused, her gaze meeting his, her eyes holding a depth of experience, of hard-won wisdom. But, she continued, her voice firm, unwavering, I'd rather live with less, Jake, and have more of myself. That's how I learned to value what really matters. She paused again, her gaze softening, a gentle question in her eyes. And you, Jake? What matters to you now? The question hung in the air between them, simple yet profound, direct yet deeply challenging. It hit Jake with unexpected force, a quiet thunderclap in the silence of the diner. What did matter to him now? He had spent so many years of his life chasing success, status, financial security, the ephemeral trappings of wealth and power, that he had never stopped, never paused, to ask himself the fundamental question, what truly mattered. But looking at Sarah, standing there in the quiet diner, surrounded by the simple tools of her trade, he started to realize, with a growing sense of clarity, that maybe the answers he had been searching for, the values he had been missing, were right there in the simplicity she embodied, in the authenticity she radiated. I'm not sure, he admitted, his voice soft, barely audible, but for the first time in a long time, completely honest. But I think, he added, a hesitant hope flickering in his voice, I think I'm starting to figure it out. The silence that followed was filled with unspoken meanings, with a quiet understanding that transcended words. Jake realized, with a sense of profound relief, that for the first time in a long while he was being truly honest, not just with himself, but with someone else. And there was something about Sarah, about her unwavering honesty, her quiet strength, that made him want to be a better person, a more authentic person, a man worthy of her quiet respect, her gentle kindness. Sarah smiled again, this time more gently, more warmly, a smile that reached her eyes, illuminating her face with a soft inner light. I think, she said, her voice soft but sure, I think that's a good start, Jake. That night, as Jake walked home through the quiet, darkened streets of the small town, he couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Sarah, about her quiet confession, about what she had revealed about herself, her past, her courageous decision to walk away from everything familiar, everything comfortable, and start over, without regrets, without bitterness. And most importantly, how at peace she seemed with the choices she had made, how grounded she was in her simple life, in her quiet strength. Maybe that was what he needed, he thought, a quiet revolution within himself, a radical shift in perspective. Maybe that's what had been missing all along, the courage to leave the past behind, to reinvent himself, to accept that he could be someone different, someone better, without needing money, without needing status, to define who he was. But there was something more, something deeper, something Jake didn't want to admit to himself. Not yet, but that was becoming clearer, more undeniable, with each passing day, with each shared conversation, with each quiet moment spent in Sarah's presence. He was starting to feel something for her, something more than just admiration, more than just gratitude, something deeper, more tender, more real. And though that realization scared him, threatened to disrupt the fragile peace he was beginning to find, it was also, paradoxically, the most real, the most genuine thing he had felt in a long, long time. The days following Sarah's quiet revelation were marked by a subtle but noticeable shift in Jake's inner world. He had spent so much time living a life that seemed defined by his possessions, by his bank account, by how the world viewed him, that now, seeing Sarah, listening to her story, he was forced to fundamentally rethink everything he thought he knew about life, about happiness, about success. What truly defined him? Who was he, stripped bare of his wealth, his status, his carefully constructed identity, and more importantly, who did he want to become moving forward in this new, uncertain, yet strangely liberating chapter of his life? His time spent with Sarah was becoming more natural, more effortless. They worked side by side at the diner, their movements synchronized, their silences comfortable, their conversations, once tentative and occasional, had become deeper, more frequent, more revealing. Jake found himself thinking about her even when she wasn't around, drawn to her quiet strength, her unwavering optimism, the way she handled the small daily challenges of life with such grace and resilience. Sarah's calmness, her inner peace, the way she seemed to find joy in the simplest things, all of it made him reflect on what truly mattered in life, on the values he had so carelessly discarded in his relentless pursuit of wealth and power. However, just as Jake was beginning to find a fragile equilibrium, to adjust to his new reality, an unexpected visitor appeared, shattering the quiet surface of his new life, dragging him back, against his will, into the world he thought he had left behind. Robert, his former business partner, the lawyer who had delivered the devastating news of his bankruptcy, had somehow managed to track him down in this forgotten town, and his sudden, unwelcome appearance stirred a complex mix of emotions in Jake, emotions he wasn't prepared to face, emotions he thought he had buried. "Jake, we need to talk." Robert's voice, sharp and businesslike, cut through the quiet afternoon air as he walked into the diner, his tailored suit and polished shoes utterly out of place in the simple, unassuming surroundings. His presence felt jarring, disruptive, a stark reminder of the life Jake had tried so hard to escape. Jake was surprised, genuinely shocked to see him, and for a fleeting moment he felt a wave of shame, of anger as he recalled the catastrophic phone call, the brutal news, the collapse of his empire, all triggered by Robert's words, by the failed investments, by the reckless pursuit of profit. But there was something in Robert's tone, in his demeanor, that seemed different this time, less aggressive, less demanding, almost conciliatory. He wasn't there to relitigate the past, to assign blame, to demand explanations. He was there to offer something new, something unexpected, something that threatened to unravel the fragile peace Jake had so painstakingly constructed. They sat at a table in the corner of the diner, away from the curious eyes of the few afternoon customers, and out of earshot of Sarah, who was busy serving a group of farmers at the counter. "What do you want, Robert?" Jake asked bluntly, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He no longer had the patience for the power games, the status-driven conversations, the manipulative tactics that had once defined their business interactions. He just wanted to understand why Robert was here, why he had sought him out, why he was disrupting the fragile equilibrium of his new life. "I came to offer you a way out, Jake," Robert began, a confident smile spreading across his face, a familiar predatory gleam in his eyes. "I have a new investment opportunity, Jake. Something big, really big. If you join me, if you partner with me again, we can recover your fortune. And this isn't small-time stuff, Jake. I'm talking about getting you back to the top, bigger than before." Robert's words hung in the air between them, thick with promises, shimmering with possibilities, laced with the seductive allure of power and wealth. For a fleeting moment, Jake felt that familiar rush, that intoxicating surge of adrenaline, the primal thrill of being involved in something grand, something consequential. He could regain it all, he thought, the fortune, the status, the life he once knew, the respect he once commanded. It would be so easy, so tempting to simply step back into his old skin, to return to the world he had once dominated, to reclaim his lost kingdom. But then he looked around the simple diner, at the worn tables, the mismatched chairs, the unpretentious atmosphere, at the life he was starting to build here, in this quiet corner of the world, a life stripped bare of artifice, rooted in authenticity. And most importantly, he looked across the room at Sarah. She was across the room smiling at a customer, her movements graceful, effortless, radiating the same quiet strength, the same unwavering kindness that had drawn him to her from the beginning. In that moment, standing at a crossroads, facing a monumental decision, Jake realized the depth of the choice he had to make, the profound implications of each path. If he accepted Robert's offer, if he chased after the phantom of his former life, it would mean leaving everything he had discovered here behind. The simplicity, the authenticity, the fragile peace he was beginning to cultivate, and perhaps most devastatingly, his burgeoning connection with Sarah, the first genuine, uncalculated relationship he had ever known. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that if he went back, if he succumbed to the seductive lure of the business world, to the world that had once defined him, he'd be diving back into the very thing that had broken him, the very thing that would inevitably pull him away from who he was becoming, from the man he was starting to glimpse in the quiet spaces of his new, unexpected life. "I won't lie, Jake," Robert continued, noticing Jake's hesitation, his prolonged silence, his internal struggle. "I know things haven't been easy for you, but you're a businessman, Jake, a natural. You know you can bounce back. You can reclaim your empire. You can become who you were meant to be." Robert leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes gleaming with ambition. "So, what do you say, Jake? Are you in?" Jake looked Robert straight in the eyes, his gaze steady, unwavering. He knew, with a profound sense of clarity, that this decision wasn't just about money, about business, about a potential financial windfall. It was about something far more fundamental, far more personal. It was about who he wanted to be, who he was choosing to become. He could go back, regress to the old Jake Miller, the ruthless businessman, the power-hungry millionaire, the man everyone admired, envied, but who he now realized, with a painful honesty, was someone fundamentally empty inside, someone defined by external validation, by the fleeting illusion of control. Or he could continue down this uncertain path, this uncharted territory, this simple, authentic life he was beginning to build, a life grounded in genuine connection, in inner peace, in the quiet satisfaction of honest work. "I don't know if I want to be that man again, Robert," Jake finally said, his voice low but steady, resolute, unwavering. Robert frowned, his confident smile faltering, replaced by an expression of bewildered disbelief. Are you serious, Jake?" he stammered, his voice laced with incredulity. "This is your chance, Jake, your chance to get back to the top. What are you doing here, cleaning tables, serving coffee? This isn't you, Jake. This isn't who you are." Jake took a deep breath, a sense of calm, almost serenity, washing over him. He knew Robert wouldn't understand, couldn't possibly comprehend the transformation he was undergoing, the quiet revolution taking place within him. But that didn't matter anymore. He didn't need Robert's approval, didn't crave his validation. He knew, with unwavering certainty, that if he accepted this offer, if he chased after the ghost of his former life, he would lose something far more valuable, something he was just beginning to comprehend, something he was only now starting to truly appreciate. "Maybe," Jake replied calmly, his voice devoid of any hint of regret. "Maybe this is who I am now, Robert. Maybe this cleaning tables, serving coffee, maybe this is me. I've learned something here, Robert. I've learned that there's more to life than money and status. Maybe you're right, maybe I am cleaning tables now. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm truly living." Robert shook his head slowly, incredulous, utterly bewildered. "You're making a mistake, Jake," he said, his tone laced with disdain, with a hint of pity. "You're throwing your life away." Jake smiled, a small, quiet smile, but there was a certain sadness in it, a gentle melancholy for the man he used to be, for the life he had left behind. He knew Robert wouldn't see things the same way, couldn't possibly understand the profound shift that had taken place within him. But he also knew, with unwavering conviction, that this was the right decision, the only decision that aligned with his newfound values, with his emerging sense of self. "No, Robert," Jake said, his voice firm, resolute, devoid of any doubt. "No, I don't think I am. I think, for the first time in a long time, I'm doing something right." With that, Jake stood up, leaving Robert sitting alone at the table, staring after him in stunned silence. He walked towards the diner door, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. There was a new lightness in his steps, a newfound sense of freedom, a profound certainty that finally, after years of chasing shadows, he was in control of his own life, charting his own course, guided by his own values. Before leaving the diner, Jake glanced over at Sarah. She was busy as always, moving with her characteristic grace and efficiency, but when their eyes met, across the small, bustling space, she smiled at him. A simple, unadorned smile, but one that was full of meaning, full of understanding, full of quiet acceptance. And in that moment, Jake knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. He stepped out of the diner into the cool afternoon air, feeling the weight of the past finally receding, feeling the promise of the future unfolding before him, a future that, while uncertain, was far more promising, far more fulfilling than any fortune he could ever regain. The fresh morning air greeted Jake as he stepped out of the diner that afternoon, the weight of the momentous decision he had just made still lingering, a subtle tremor beneath the surface of his newfound calm. But to his surprise, he felt no regret, no lingering doubt, only a profound sense of peace. A quiet certainty that he had finally chosen the right path, the authentic path, the path that was truly his. For the first time in his life, Jake had chosen what was right for him, what resonated with his deepest values, not what others expected of him, not what society dictated, not what the relentless pursuit of wealth and power demanded. As he walked through the quiet streets of the small town, the familiar rhythm of his new life settling around him, Jake reflected on the profound transformation he had undergone, on how drastically his life had changed in such a short span of time. He had arrived in this forgotten corner of the world a broken man, stripped bare, lost, and without identity, clinging to the wreckage of his former self. Now, he was walking with purpose, with a newfound sense of direction, with a clear perspective on what truly mattered, on the values that would now guide his life. It wasn't money, it wasn't power, it wasn't status, but the simplicity, the authenticity, the genuine human connection he was discovering day by day, the quiet strength he was cultivating within himself. As he approached his rented house, the small, unassuming dwelling that had become his sanctuary, Jake realized that his thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah. Ever since she had shared her story, her past, her own journey of transformation with him, something had shifted, something had deepened in their connection. Jake felt a growing bond with her, a profound sense of understanding, a quiet intimacy unlike anything he had ever experienced before. He knew, with a dawning certainty, that beyond any internal transformation, beyond any newfound clarity of purpose, Sarah was one of the main reasons he was starting to find himself again, starting to rebuild not just his life, but his very soul. Later that night, drawn by an irresistible pull, Jake returned to the diner. Sarah was finishing her shift, methodically cleaning the tables, tidying up the small space, preparing it for the next day's rush. As she saw him walk in, a familiar figure silhouetted against the fading evening light, she gave him a calm, welcoming smile, unaware of the momentous decision he had made that day, unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken place within him. "Here for dinner?" Sarah asked, a playful lilt in her voice, raising a questioning eyebrow as she approached him, wiping her hands on her apron. Jake chuckled lightly, the sound genuine, unburdened. "Actually," he said, his gaze meeting hers, holding it with a newfound sincerity, a quiet intensity, "I came to talk." Sarah stopped what she was doing, leaned against a table and crossed her arms, her expression shifting from playful to intrigued, a spark of curiosity in her eyes, sensing that something significant had happened. Something was different about Jake tonight. "Oh?" she said, her voice soft, expectant, waiting for him to continue. Jake hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words, the words that could capture the enormity of the decision he had made, the profound shift in his perspective. But as he looked into Sarah's eyes, into their depths of understanding, of quiet acceptance, he realized he didn't need any grand speeches, any elaborate explanations. He just needed to be honest, to be vulnerable, to speak from his heart. "Robert came to see me today," Jake began, his voice low, steady, watching her expression subtly change, a flicker of recognition, of understanding in her eyes. "He offered me a chance to get it all back." Sarah remained silent, her gaze unwavering, waiting for him to continue, sensing the weight of what he was about to reveal. "The money, the status, the life I had before." Jake elaborated, his voice almost a whisper, the words carrying the weight of his past, the shadow of his former self. I turned it down, he finished, his voice gaining strength, conviction, without hesitation, without regret. Sarah blinked, visibly surprised, a flicker of astonishment in her eyes. She hadn't expected that, not from Jake Miller, the man she had known as the ex-millionaire, the fallen titan, still grappling with the wreckage of his former life, still seemingly haunted by the ghosts of his lost fortune. She hadn't expected him to turn down a chance to reclaim everything he had lost, to return to the world he had once dominated. Why? She finally asked, her voice soft, her tone filled with genuine curiosity, wanting to understand the depth of his decision, the reasoning behind his unexpected choice. Why did you turn it down, Jake? Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the answer on his lips, the weight of his transformation, the weight of his newfound purpose. Because, he said, his voice clear, firm, unwavering, because that's not who I am anymore, Sarah. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, holding it with unwavering honesty. I used to think money defined who I was, that without it I was nothing, worthless. But after losing everything, after being stripped bare, I realized I was wrong. Terribly wrong. What really matters, he continued, his voice softening, becoming more intimate, more vulnerable. What really matters can't be bought, Sarah. It can't be quantified, it can't be traded, it can't be lost in a market crash. Sarah watched him closely, her expression thoughtful, her gaze searching, considering his words, weighing their depth, their sincerity. There was a profound authenticity in what Jake was saying, a quiet conviction that resonated deeply with her own experience, with her own hard-won wisdom. She knew how difficult it was to walk away from a life of luxury and wealth, to reject the seductive allure of material possessions, to redefine success on your own terms. And hearing Jake speak so sincerely, so vulnerably about his transformation, about his newfound values, made her admire him even more, respect him on a deeper level. "And what really matters to you now, Jake?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle, her smile soft, encouraging him to continue, to reveal the heart of his transformation. Jake stepped closer, bridging the small space between them, feeling his heart race a little, a gentle flutter of anticipation, of hope. He knew the answer to her question was simple, yet profound, deeply personal, and filled with unspoken meaning. He looked directly into Sarah's eyes, into their depths of kindness, of understanding, and said, his voice low, intimate, filled with a quiet passion, "What really matters to me now, Sarah, is being honest. Being honest about who I am, about what I feel, about what I truly value." He paused briefly, gathering his courage, taking another step closer until they were standing just inches apart, their breaths mingling in the quiet air of the diner. "Sarah," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, his gaze unwavering, locked on hers. You are one of the reasons I'm rediscovering who I really am. You and this quiet life, this simple town, this unexpected second chance. And I feel..." He hesitated again, the words catching in his throat. "I feel that with you by my side, with your strength, your kindness, your unwavering honesty, I can continue to be the best version of myself, the man I was always meant to be." Sarah stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing his words, letting them sink in, feeling the weight of his vulnerability, the sincerity of his confession. A gentle smile, slow and radiant, appeared on her lips, spreading across her face, illuminating her eyes with a soft inner light. She took a small step towards him, closing the remaining space between them, her gaze meeting his, holding it with a quiet intensity, a shared understanding. "Jake," she said, her voice barely audible, a soft whisper in the quiet diner. "I've seen you change, Jake. I've watched you grow, watched you rediscover yourself, since the moment you arrived here lost and broken. And to be honest," she admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly, a delicate blush rising to her skin, "I feel something for you too, Jake." Jake's heart leaped, a sudden surge of joy, of relief, of profound connection. This was it, he realized. This was something real, something genuine, something unlike anything he had ever experienced before, in his former life of wealth and power, in his superficial world of fleeting pleasures and manufactured emotions. It wasn't about money, status, power, or external validation. It was something much simpler, yet infinitely more profound, infinitely more valuable. It was about being real, being vulnerable, being seen, truly seen, and embracing what truly mattered. Love, connection, authenticity, inner peace. They stood in silence for a few seconds, the quiet diner around them seeming to fade away, the world shrinking to the space between them, to the unspoken emotions that flowed between them, connecting them in a bond that transcended words. There was no need for grand promises, no need for elaborate declarations of eternal love. What they had, right then and there, in that quiet moment of shared vulnerability, of mutual recognition, was enough. It was real. It was true. It was just the beginning. Jake stepped forward, his hand reaching out instinctively, and without hesitation, he took Sarah's hand in his. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a soft light, and in that moment, everything seemed to fall into place, the pieces of his shattered life finally aligning, forming a new, unexpected, and infinitely more beautiful picture. They didn't need grand gestures or elaborate pronouncements. They just needed each other. And in that quiet, unassuming diner in that forgotten corner of the world, they had found something precious, something real, something that would last. The following week, Jake made the decision to stay in the small town, to make it his home, to build his future here, alongside Sarah. He didn't know exactly what the future held, what challenges lay ahead, what unexpected turns their lives might take. But he knew, with unwavering certainty, that he was finally on the right path. The authentic path, the path that led to genuine happiness, to lasting fulfillment. He had made peace with his past, with his failures, with his losses, and was learning day by day to value the present, to cherish the simple beauty of everyday life, to appreciate the quiet joy of genuine connection, all alongside Sarah, his partner, his confidant, his love. One day, as they walked together through the endless fields of corn surrounding the small town, the golden sunlight warming their faces, Sarah turned to Jake, her expression thoughtful, a hint of gentle curiosity in her eyes. "Do you think," she asked, her voice soft, carried on the gentle breeze, "do you think you would have made this choice, Jake? Would you have found this life, this peace, if you hadn't lost everything?" Jake paused for a moment, stopping in the middle of the field, the tall cornstalks rustling around them, reflecting on her question, considering the profound, unexpected journey he had taken. He knew, with a quiet certainty, that if he hadn't gone through the catastrophic loss, the public humiliation, the brutal stripping away of everything he thought defined him, he probably never would have met Sarah, never would have found this quiet town, never would have learned the hard but ultimately liberating lessons that now defined him, that now shaped his understanding of life, of happiness, of true wealth. He probably would have continued chasing shadows, pursuing fleeting illusions, clinging to a life built on superficiality, on external validation, on the endless pursuit of more. "I think," he replied, turning to face her, his gaze meeting hers, his voice filled with a quiet conviction, a profound gratitude. "I think sometimes, Sarah, you have to lose everything to find what really matters." He smiled then, a genuine, unburdened smile, a smile that reached his eyes, illuminating his face with an inner light. Sarah smiled back, her eyes shining with understanding, with love, and they continued walking, hand in hand, side by side, through the golden fields towards the future, a future that for Jake was now clear, now bright with possibility, now filled with the quiet promise of lasting happiness. It didn't matter how much he had lost in the past, how deeply he had fallen, because what he had found in the wreckage of his former life was far more valuable, far more enduring than any fortune he could have ever imagined. Months melted into a year, and then the most important, most profoundly meaningful moment of Jake's transformed life arrived. He stood at the altar, not in a gilded ballroom, not surrounded by a sea of strangers, but in a small, sun-drenched church in the heart of the quiet town, surrounded by the faces of people who truly knew him, who truly cared. But this time, he stood next to someone who embodied everything true, everything authentic, everything valuable that he had discovered in the ashes of his former life. Sarah. Sarah, radiant in a simple, elegant white dress, stood by his side, her hand warm in his, smiling with the same quiet lightness, the same unwavering kindness that had won his heart from the very beginning, that had guided him through the darkness and into the light. Around them, friends and family, a small, intimate gathering witnessed the simple, heartfelt ceremony. There was no pomp, no extravagance, no excessive luxury, just genuine emotion, quiet joy, and the palpable sense of love filling the small church. It was exactly how Jake had always imagined a wedding should be, deep down, beneath the layers of societal expectation and superficial glamour, genuine, authentic, intimate, and overflowing with love. As Sarah spoke her vows, her voice soft but clear, her eyes locked on his, Jake felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over him, a quiet serenity he had never known in his previous life. He had finally found everything he had ever truly sought, not in great fortunes or successful business ventures, not in the fleeting trappings of wealth and power, but in the simple, enduring, and utterly sincere love of a woman who saw him, truly saw him for who he was, not for who society expected him to be, not for what he possessed, but for the man he was, at his core. After the ceremony, as they walked hand in hand down the aisle, bathed in the warm glow of the afternoon sun, Jake and Sarah were greeted with warm hugs, heartfelt congratulations, and genuine smiles from their friends and family, a small circle of love and support. Among them, standing proudly, beaming with joy, was Mike, his best friend, his unwavering confidant, who smiled as if he had known all along, from that devastating wedding day in Chicago, that things would eventually, inevitably end up exactly like this, in this small church, in this quiet town, in this moment of perfect, unadorned happiness. And beside Sarah, cradled peacefully in a stroller, bathed in the soft afternoon light, Jake saw the future unfold before his eyes, a future filled with love, with family, with purpose. They were not alone. Two small bundles of joy, twins, rested peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in gentle rhythm, their innocent faces serene, their presence a tangible symbol of the new life Jake and Sarah had built together, the fruits of the love they had cultivated, the promise of a future filled with laughter, with challenges, with shared joy. Their children, the living embodiment of the love that Jake and Sarah had built from the ashes of his former life. A testament to the transformative power of loss, of resilience, of genuine connection. Jake looked at his children, their tiny faces reflecting the golden sunlight, then turned to Sarah, his wife, his partner, his soulmate, feeling a profound sense of completeness, a quiet joy that overflowed his heart. He had found the true wealth in life, he realized, not in material possessions, not in fleeting accolades, but in the enduring treasures of love, family, and inner peace. Nothing, absolutely nothing in his former life of wealth and power could compare to this simple, unadorned moment of perfect happiness, this profound sense of belonging, this quiet certainty that he was finally, truly home. And so, as the sun began to set on the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields of corn, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Jake knew, with unwavering conviction, that despite all he had lost, all he had endured, he had gained something far greater, something infinitely more valuable. He didn't need the ghosts of the past to define his future, didn't need the validation of the world to measure his success. Everything he needed, everything he had ever truly craved, was right there beside him, in Sarah's loving gaze, in the innocent faces of his sleeping children, in the quiet promise of a life built on love, on authenticity, on inner peace. And this time, he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, he had finally found what truly mattered.